From a persuasion that equal liberty was originally the portion, it is still the birthright of all men, and influenced by the strong ties of humanity and the principles of their institution. Your memorialists conceive themselves bound to use all justifiable endeavors to loosen the bounds of slavery and promote a general enjoyment of the blessings of freedom. Under these impressions, they earnestly entreat your serious attention to the subject of slavery, that you will be pleased to countenance the restoration of liberty to those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage, and who amidst the general joy of surrounding freemen are groaning in servile subjugation, that you will devise means for removing this inconsistency from the character of the American people, that you will promote mercy and justice towards this distressed race, and that you will step to the very verge of the powers vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. Philadelphia, February 3rd, 1790, and signed by B. Franklin, President of the Society. Good afternoon. My name is George Washington, and I have the honor of being the President of our United States of America. And in the last few days, this memorial from the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, and the Improvement of the Condition of the African Races has been delivered to our legislature, both the Senate and our House of Representatives. It calls for a stopping of all trafficking of slaves. In these last several years, the issue of owning slaves has grown in our nation. And in fact, a number of states have taken action towards forbidding the practice of slavery within their own borders. Pennsylvania, for instance, has freed all of their slaves, willy-nilly, without any concern to their personal circumstances and situations. In fact, they've gone so far as to free slaves visiting in Pennsylvania. Other states have continued on in the practice of holding Negro bondsmen. I fear this becomes a very divisive issue in our nation. We have seen an increase in all matter of faction these few years. Gone are those days of the spirit of '76 when we were bound together in one cause. But now we let our individual circumstances, our personal preferences, our local pursuits and concerns hold sway. And now this one. What a challenge this causes to our nation. In these last few years, it's been apparent to me that slavery is dying a natural death. It is far less profitable than it once was, and more men have openly spoken against the practice. Even my home state, since '82 now, it has been legal to free slaves, which was forbidden us in times past. And more men have taken that opportunity amongst themselves. Oh, don't get me wrong. This isn't just for the point of justice. Some men do it for justice. But it is also that the economic circumstances aren't the benefit they once were. Our primary cash crop used to be tobacco. Tobacco ruins the land, and in most cases, particularly the more populated, wealthier counties of Virginia, have moved to the production of wheat, which requires far less labor. And so in some cases, it is simply that the economics are no longer viable. That's one of the reasons why the greatest supporters of this practice are further south. Charleston and South Carolina come to mind immediately, where rice still finds a great need of inexpensive labor. But to cause a rent to our nation and to push the division in these opinions, when the matter appears to be dying a natural death on its own, it seems unwise. It hasn't usually been my custom to speak publicly on these issues, and in no small part because what is important to me is the survival of our union. We must do whatever is necessary that our union, just newly gained and arrived at, might be preserved. Our nation is in too weak and frail a circumstance to take upon it such a great risk, to see itself divided asunder. And it seems even less wise, as I suggested before, when the practice seems to be coming to a natural conclusion all on its own. I don't know what action the Congress will take. The fact that Dr. Franklin's name on this will certainly carry a great deal of weight. But these aren't exactly new concerns. And there are other means by which they may be answered. Now, during the war, I was aided by a young Frenchman, the Marquis de Lafayette. And you will never meet a man with a more beneficent soul than the Marquis de Lafayette. And just 4 years ago, he wrote to me, he has long had this scheme of buying slaves and purchasing land and freeing upon them. And he notified me just a few years ago that he's done that very thing. He states that, where is this? I have purchased 125,000 French livres, a plantation in the colony of Cayenne, and am going to free my Negroes in order to make that experiment, which you know is my hobby horse. I fear I may have disappointed him. I think he was hoping that I might provide some support and aid in this scheme myself. But as I mentioned earlier, I have endeavored to remain private on my opinions regarding the practice of slavery. I cannot allow myself to be used as a weapon of division with one side against the other by embracing my own personal opinions. But let me assure you, my opinions are this. I have no greater regret than we have continued to see this practice on our shores. I wish that I might find a way that I might be removed from it, but not at the risk of our union. That's certainly not at the risk of our nation. These are not easy matters to concern one with. It is one of the greatest risks I fear our nation faces. My opinion certainly leans on the side of those abolitionists, though I am of the opinion that this abolition must be done slowly. It must be nearly imperceptible. And the people in question must be brought to a level of education necessary that they might live as free members of a free society. To simply cast them adrift immediately, that has been done in Philadelphia. That'll be productive of much inconvenience and mischief. I think the actions we have followed in Virginia are wiser, or in Massachusetts for that matter. Massachusetts hasn't ended the practice of slavery within their commonwealth. But what they've done is they have allowed slave owners to free their slaves if they see fit, provided that the society is assured that that slave will not become a threat to society. That what I mean by that is that the slave will not be supported as a free man by society, that they can earn their own livelihood. We've adopted similar practices in Virginia. For a Virginian to free a slave, he must secure a bond with the government, particularly in the case of very young or very elderly, that bond may be used to support that now freed man, so he not become a burden on society. And this, I think, is much wiser counsel than what has been adopted in Pennsylvania, the freeing of all these people willy-nilly without any concern to their present circumstances or conditions or knowledge and understanding. To simply cast them adrift immediately. It is not at all aidful to themselves or to society. But I mentioned that it is not my custom to share my opinions in these matters publicly. But we are all friends. And perhaps I might rely on you to receive my words, not as coming from the President of these United States of America, but rather nothing more than a friend. And that I might assure on your confidence that if I speak to you my private opinions in these matters, that they will not be carried out into public society, and that I will not find my words printed into the Philadelphia Aurora and used against me. Can I rely on you upon that? If so, I would like to make myself available that I might answer what questions or concerns you may have.
Thank you, President Washington, and you can be assured of our discretion on this very sensitive subject. You just stated, sir, that you have no greater regret about the institution and that you wish that you could find a way to remove yourself from it. Have you always felt this way regarding slavery?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I was born in Virginia, and slavery is very much, and has always been through my lifetime, the practice in that place. I myself have owned slaves since my father died when I was 11. In my youth, just as I expanded my property holdings by purchasing and selling a real estate, I also purchased and sold movable property, including slaves. But even before the war begun, in 1973, I begun to doubt the justice of the practice. In no small part because of arguments made very well by my neighbor at Gunston Hall, Mr. George Mason. I decided I would no longer buy or sell any slaves unless I were forced to it. And then, of course, the war came. The war changed my environments. And I was surrounded by New England men. And there are, of course, slaves in New England, but they have never had the numbers in New England that we have had in the South. And their opinions towards manumission, towards the freeing of these people, advanced far quicker than our own. And I was surrounded by more and more men who already stood against the practice. And I had a marvelous opportunity of meeting, not in person, but by way of letters, a young female slave and poetress by the name of Phyllis Wheatley. In fact, she did me the great honor. She wrote a poem in my honor. And I have to admit, I took too long to thank her for the matter. I wrote a letter to her, and I apologized for my lateness. I told her that I appreciated the poem, and I also told her that it had been my intention to print my response and her poem within the newspapers there in Massachusetts. This was in the early days of the war. And I also told her the reasons I didn't. The poem wasn't mine. It were not my property to share with the public. It were her property. Besides, in how any shape of humility could I have a poem printed in my own honor? And of course, by war's end. By the war's end, if you were to march on our company streets and amongst the army that won for us our liberty, you would never have failed to notice that 1 in 6 of every face looking back at you from our company lines were men of color, were free blacks. These men proved themselves alongside of us in the field of honor. Now, my opinions in these matters have certainly changed over the years.
Thank you, sir. You were speaking about some of the people you met during the wartime years, and I believe I'm correct in saying that it was also the young Frenchman, the Marquis de Lafayette, that you met during that time. Did he have any great influence on your changing thoughts about slavery? I know you mentioned his scheme earlier. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could share your thoughts on that as well.
You will never meet any man who's a greater supporter of all the rights of man and applies them to all men than Gilbert, the Marquis de Lafayette. And he has had the advantage in life not only because of the circumstances of his birth, but also of his wealth, that he has taken the opportunity to make good on his beliefs. And I believe that posterity will only smile the stronger upon the Marquis because he has been able to take action and to provide freedom to some of these people. I am very proud to call Gilbert amongst my friends. In fact, my greatest regret is I fear I may never see him again.
I hope that you will, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
During your opening remarks, President Washington, you mentioned several times that slavery is dying a natural death. And you did not wish to, pardon my very simple terminology, but stir the pot, as it were. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by slavery dying a natural death.
Well, it is a twofold answer on that matter. One of them I think I addressed to a small degree, and that is that the profits gained are no longer the case. When Virginia were first founded, they had no idea how they would make money. The original thought was that we would find gold laying upon the ground, as the Spaniards found in the South Americas. But, of course, that wasn't to be here. And a number of different means were attempted and practiced and devised to try to find some way that Virginia might be made successful. And finally, tobacco was introduced to our shores. Oh, there's a wild tobacco that grows here, but not the tobacco that is smoked generally. And that was just the ticket. Tobacco became Virginia's gold, and our profits were made by way of tobacco. But tobacco is not only hard on the land, it is hard on the farmer. It is a very, very labor-intensive crop. It takes a full 13 months between the time when a tobacco plant is planted to which it is finally ready to be sold off to market. Over a year. And constant work through most of those matters, with the pitching of the tobacco from its original field into the field that it's grown in, the suckering of the plant, the removing of the worms, the cutting of the leaves, the drying and preparing of the leaves. All of these matters together, a great deal of labor. Originally, we relied on free labor, on indentured servants, men who would put themselves into bondage only temporarily to pay for their transportation to Virginia. But in time, slavery was introduced to our shores. Virginia would never have had the financial success that it has had without that labor. But these are the times of our grandparents. Matters have changed. Most of these same lands which used to produce tobacco no longer can. And most of Virginia has moved away from the production of that plant to wheat. Wheat isn't as profitable as tobacco, but it requires far less labor. Most of the time it sits and grows and works upon itself and requires very little labor. So the need for this labor is far reduced. I think I mentioned there are some places where this isn't true. In South Carolina, they make their money in a great deal by rice, and rice is labor intensive. In the West Indies, outside of our nation now, there is no greater injury and difficulty into the matter of slaves than the sugar trade, the most dangerous of all of these trades, not practiced particularly within our shores. As long as matters stay as they are now, and I did mention twofold, and I've spoken at great length only to the first. The second is that we have seen an enlightenment amongst our men. I think I mentioned that Virginia has changed the laws regarding manumission. Do you know the first time I even heard that discussed? There was a young man. He was a new member of the House of Burgesses there in Williamsburg, Virginia. You may have heard of him. He's presently my Secretary of the State, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. And he, along with Colonel Bland, wrote a bill they hoped to pass as Virginia law that simply served to ease the life of our slaves. And it was laughed at and tabled and never even voted upon. And yet, within just a few years, Virginia attempted to stop the importation of slaves. They have offered the freeing of slaves. These opinions have changed. More and more men speak towards the removal of slavery, even in Virginia. So yes, I think in time, the practice will die on its own, and we should allow it to do so.
Thank you, sir, for that. We have a question from Tracy in regard to the frequency that you might discuss this topic with your wife, Mrs. Washington. In particular, Tracy has been interested in whether or not you and Mrs. Washington have discussed the possibility of emancipating her enslaved individuals with the understanding that she doesn't technically, nor do you, own them. If you could speak a little bit about that, sir.
Well, after a fashion, you've already answered your question, ma'am. My wife owns one slave, and she's free to do with her slave what she wishes, but most of the slaves you're referring to are not hers. They are custos slaves. They belong at present to her grandchildren. She has no authority to alter their circumstances or to provide manumission to them. She has, in fact, beyond no authority, she has a requirement or a duty to provide for those grandchildren by maintaining the property as best she can until that time comes. I should also mention, I was asked earlier about my opinions and if they have changed over these matters, and they have. I would argue my wife hasn't considered it in the similar fashion, and nor has she had some of the same experiences I have. We of course discuss matters, though. My wife and I discuss all things.
Thank you, sir. We have had a comment from Angie who said that they have a family member who is a free black man that fought under you at Yorktown, and they were wondering if you might comment a little bit more about the free black people that fought in the war.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned earlier that we relied on 1/6 of that army being freemen. I should also mention, in the point of all fairness, that when I first took the authority, when I was made General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army back in 75, the Congress stated that we would not take Negroes in the Army, and that was partly on my suggestion. And the reason I wish to mention this is very quickly I learned that was an error. There were already blacks serving with us, and they were allowed to finish their term of service. And of course, if we refused to allow them to re-enlist, they might simply take themselves to the enemy. Furthermore, free white men were not as quick to answer the call as I would have preferred. We couldn't afford to send anyone away. And lastly, and perhaps just as important, these free blacks served just as well and just as honorably as any other men of the Army. Now I should mention, because I keep mentioning free blacks, you can't expect a slave to fight in defense of your liberty. So slaves didn't serve in our army, but former slaves did. Most of the men that enlisted in our army, like the gentleman that you mentioned in your home, most of these men were free blacks, but there were slaves who enlisted with the knowledge and with the permission of their owners and their states. And the whole reason for this was that by service in our army, they were freed. This is why the state had to be concerned as well.
Thank you, sir. This is going to be our last question of you, sir. I understand that there is going to be another gentleman who is going to join us very shortly, but we would like to end our time with you by asking, you've been kind enough to address us from a private setting, understanding that you are the symbol of the country currently in your public role. But when you take a step away from this public sphere, is there anything that you intend on doing as a private citizen to address this subject in your own life?
I have endeavored to find some means by which I might remove myself from this practice. I've even tried to get tenant farmers to rent my land and then to hire their own servants rather than relying on slavery. And then I could make my livelihood and free my people by way of the profits from being a landlord. But I've had very little success, truth be told, in finding these said tenants. I've had no success in those matters at all. I am considering I have mentioned, I think, more than once now, since we've been engaged in this conversation, that in Virginia, it is now lawful to manumit slaves. I also mentioned that one of the requirements is that we secure a bond with the court to determine that there not be a challenge to society, that these people will not go hungry, nor live at the expense of society, but rather at my expense, if necessary. And of course, this takes a great deal of money. And the usual means by which slaves are freed in Virginia is by way through a man's will. Because that's, of course, when you have the most amount of money that you might use to secure bonds. I haven't decided for certain, but I have discussed with my wife the possibility that I might very well take that action as my own final act. And with that, I fear that our time together has grown short. Pleasant time spent together, but far too premature, brought to an end. I thank you for your time, and I will take my leave, and you'll soon be joined by another who may answer what further questions you may have on this challenging topic of slavery.
George Washington served 2 terms as President of the United States from 1789 to 1797. Though he took no public action against the institution of slavery, his private letters show an increasing distaste for the practice during his lifetime. George Washington died on December 14, 1799. In his will, he freed those individuals that he held in bondage. Historians have grappled with the intention of his last act since his death. Was it a private action, or was it meant to be a public one? Ron Carnegie is the performer and historian who portrays President George Washington. We invite you now to continue this conversation with him as he discusses George Washington and slavery.
Hello. My name is Ron Carnegie. I think I've been introduced. And before I start taking your questions, I do want to address one matter that came up earlier. As George Washington, I was asked why he thought slavery was coming to an end. And I think it's worthy to mention before we continue that Washington was wrong. Besides the fact that the number of slaves kept increasing even in that period, there would be a development in the United States that would change everything and that would really hurt the present slaves in that period more than anything else, perhaps. In a way, much to the surprise of the inventor. And I'm speaking of a man named Eli Whitney, who made an improvement on the cotton gin, which suddenly took a new crop in Virginia, and the American South, that had not been a major commercial crop and made it viable. Whitney himself thought it would reduce the necessity of labor and the need for slaves. But what it did is it made cotton a hugely important financial crop to the United States, particularly to the southern states. And it changed the profitable aspect of slavery. So Washington, of course, that happened towards the end of his presidency, the beginning of that, but he didn't see what the end event was, the final effect would be, which of course we all have. And Washington's plans for how slavery should have ended, of course, took a divergent turn. But I'd like to go ahead and take whatever questions you may have. And we don't need to feel confined by the binds of history or the difficulty of being trapped in 1790. But we can take whatever questions you might have, preferably on the subject of today's live video cast on the subject of slavery.
Thank you for joining us and being willing to speak out of character as well. We have had a few questions for you away from President Washington. The first one that we have comes from Susan, who asks if most visitors to Colonial Williamsburg tend to judge historic people according to today's standards, and how do you deal with that?
Interesting question, Susan. It certainly happens. When you're playing an iconic character, someone like Washington, there's opposite things that happen. There are some people who judge these men by unrealistic standards and hold them up as if they are impervious of any wrongdoing, that they couldn't possibly have made errors, that they are American saints. And like you say, there are also those who hold them bound by our modern ways of thinking and our modern circumstances. That's going to happen, I think. I think it's bound to happen. We will always judge people by the rules by which we live and how we live our lives. I also think, whether it's fair or not, I think it's worthy of consideration. And to remember that these men were just men, and they had their shortcomings. To expect them to meet to modern ideals is unrealistic. We are in a process, and have been through civilization, of improving on who we are and learning to be better people, individually and as societies and to each other.
Thank you, sir. Michelle has asked a topic that has been coming up recently on social media. There has been a long post where some have say you learn about President or Washington's wooden teeth, but you didn't learn about that he purchased teeth from slaves. So Michelle has asked, as someone who took a class on Black history, it said in the class that Washington pulled his slaves' teeth to use in his dentures. Is this true?
We don't know. All that's available to the historical record, and this is what the reference you're making comes from, is that Washington paid slaves for teeth. We know that he paid them, we know how much he paid them, and I apologize, I don't remember what that amount is, so don't ask me. But the record does show that he paid for teeth. What we don't know is what the situation of those teeth were. I wish I did. In fact, I'm going to be really honest with you right now, and I specifically asked if this question came up earlier that it not be asked, because Washington would know where those teeth came from and how they were used. But we do not. All we know is that he paid slaves for teeth, whether they were pulled from the mouths of slaves or whether they were teeth that had by natural means come out. We don't know. We don't know. Whatever happened to them, we don't know. Washington's teeth were not made of wood. Only 3 sets survive, and none of those are made with human teeth, though it's clear from the record that some of them were. There were also attempts at doing transplants on Washington's teeth that all failed, probably because they didn't know what they were doing. That's what I suspect those teeth may have been being used for. But we don't actually know. We don't actually know. I wish I did. That's an important thing to know. There's a big difference between buying a loose tooth from somebody and buying a tooth that you have wrenched out of somebody's mouth. And because they're slaves, the other question we don't know is, how much say did they even have in the matter? Yes, he paid them, but was it by their agreement or was it forced? That we don't know. We don't know. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but historically we don't know.
Thank you, sir. Jim has asked several questions, and the first of his that I'll ask you, I personally have some thoughts on as well, but I'd love to hear your answer. His question is, didn't Washington's freeing of his enslaved people make it hard on Mrs. Washington running Mount Vernon, and what was her opinion on their release?
Well, I'll start first by saying, no, it wouldn't have made life directly hard on her, except possibly mentally, because Washington's will actually only freed one slave immediately, and that was William Lee. William Lee had been, until he had been disabled permanently, he had been Washington's valet, that is Washington's personal manservant, and he'd served throughout the war, and in honor of that service, he was freed immediately. He was given a stipend to support him for the rest of his life, and he was free to either stay at Mount Vernon or to go elsewhere. he ends up staying. He ends up staying at Mount Vernon. But the rest of them were not to be freed until Martha Washington's death. So as to the way the question was worded, it wouldn't have affected the running of the household because she still had their use of them. I should mention that's not the reason Washington gave. Washington states that he mentions that it's going to divide the families, and it does. Unlike whites in the period, blacks will not marry cousins or closer. The white society had no difficulty marrying cousins, but the taboos in black society meant they had to be farther related than that. And so an advantage that happened in earlier life, it'll be an advantage, it'll be a disadvantage with the will, is that when Washington, an owner of a lot of slaves, married Martha Washington, Martha Custis at the time, also with a lot of slaves, suddenly these slaves were now all living together on the same plantation with people they weren't related to, because some were from Fairfax, Virginia, and the others from New Kent, Virginia. So they all quickly marry amongst each other. So Washington's freeing his slaves meant the possibility that these families would be broken up. And so he states, so that there not be this disorder, this unhappiness, and this despair, it'll be put off to Martha's death. There is a problem with that. I don't know whose despair he's referring to, because it's still going to separate families when Martha dies. So it may only be her despair, I don't know. I also, lastly, want to mention, and this is in no small part because of recent research by the woman that has the honor of playing Martha Washington for Colonial Williamsburg, our Martha Washington has started to come with, the story you'll normally hear is that these slaves were freed a little bit early because Martha was afraid that her life might be threatened. But our Martha Washington has found documents showing that she began work and was laying out the course and the plan to free them immediately on Washington's death. So she was involved. She no doubt knew it was coming. It wasn't a great surprise, and she was actually taking those actions from the beginning of it being her charge to resolving those matters. This may be the first time that's been said publicly.
Well, we have it on video, so now it's forevermore in history. Jim has also asked another question, specifically about one enslaved individual who ran and secured her own freedom,
yes.
Ona Judge, and if you believe that had any impact on Washington's feelings towards slavery.
I don't think it impacted his opinions much. Some parts of it show, we haven't really talked about how Washington was as a slave master. I'm surprised by that, but I'm not disappointed. I say that because too often we try to determine whether our founding fathers were bad or good slave owners, forgetting that slavery is always wrong. So yes, there's differing methods or differing levels of good and bad, I suppose, but still we're often trying to sugarcoat a matter that should never have been in the first place. But in some ways, Ona Judge was an example of that. I am absolutely convinced that Washington's preference would have been to leave her alone, not because he thought she had done the right thing, not because he supported her running away to freedom, but rather because of what I mentioned earlier, that he was trying to keep his opinions regarding slavery private, to not be divisive and not to be part of the issue. And now he's got a runaway slave that his wife really wants back. That puts Washington in a very difficult political position. And for a while, he does try to make his wife happy. What do they say? A happy wife is a happy life. But in the end, he stands by his guns and he stops. When I was talking about this kind of slave master he was, what I was referring to, I'm going to come back to that, is he actually offered to give freedom to Ona Judge's child if she would come back. And Ona wanted assurance that she'd be freed and the child would be freed, and Washington refused that. And in a way that I think is a very modern concept, he was refusing to give her what she wanted, to basically let her to generate what he considers bad behavior by giving her what she wanted by having committed the bad behavior in the first place. So he wasn't going to acknowledge that. So she doesn't come back.
Joe from Ohio wants to know how you balance your personal feelings along with the historical perspective.
My personal feelings, do you think about slavery, or?
I think so.
Well, I think I made it pretty obvious by something I said a moment ago. Clearly, I don't support slavery. And I'm an actor. I'm an actor and a historian. And when I'm playing a character, my job isn't to share with you my opinions or my belief. It's to share his. I do have the advantage that I play Washington, and I'm playing a man that became more and more against slavery, but he also didn't do much about it. He only took one public action, and some historians even doubt whether that was a public action. I believe the last will was meant to be a public action, and what would have made it public was, I think his hopes were that other men would follow that as an example. That's why I call what would normally have been a private situation a public one. But that's all he ever does. Everything that you heard me say before about his opinions about slavery, that's from private letters that are fortunate enough that are available to us today. But he hid that and tried to stay completely out of the argument and to hide his opinions and remain stoic on the subject. Might not have been the best actions. But when I'm playing Washington, my job is to teach you about Washington and who that man is, what he believed, what he thought, and what his worldview and the worldview around him is. That goes to the question we had earlier about judging people by the past. We're all shaped by the society and the world we live in. Even those of us who are discussing today, and I'm sure that nobody watching this supports slavery, but we're all modern people, raised in a modern world, surrounded by modern opinions, and we wouldn't be the same people we are now if we had been born 400 years ago. We like to think we would be, but it's just not really the way humans work.
Thank you for that. Our last question today is, what advice might George Washington have given us in a modern time in regard to the issues surrounding what our country is facing right now?
I mentioned earlier that under George Washington's presidency, we saw a number of different issues and factions arising, and the nation was becoming divided very strongly on various political issues. The one we've been talking about today is only one of those issues. And Washington endeavored to remind us that this is a nation of many diverse people and diverse opinions, but we get our strength by that diversity. In a free nation, difference of opinion is not a crime. Difference of opinion is what gives a free nation its strength, and we should always remember that. I'm also, as Ron, going to mention that I'm going to remind you that the Founding Fathers viewed the work as they did with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They viewed it as an experiment. We haven't always met the ideals and the promises that have been laid out by the Constitution. But the experiment's ongoing. We're not done. It's our job together to continue to make this nation what it can be. Don't judge this nation by its past or what we've done or have failed to do in the past, but rather by what we can be. And let us join together to make good on those unanswered promises.